Chapter 26, The Cold War Abroad and at Home, 1945 to 1960. When World War II ended in 1945, President Harry S. Truman's first problems were demobilization of the armed forces and reconversion to a peacetime economy. Returning veterans had to adjust to changes not only in themselves, but also in their families. The GI Bills fueled a boom in education, housing, and consumer demand, not to mention babies. As the economy grew and wartime price controls were dismantled, prices shot up rapidly. Inflation increased labor's demands for higher wages, and a series of strikes swept the nation. With inflation, strikes, and shortages, an angry electorate returned to control of Congress to the Republicans in the 1946 midterm elections. Further, antagonism between the United States and the Soviet Union grew as Soviet-dominated governments were established in Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and Poland. In 1945, the victorious Allied powers came together to found the United Nations, an international organization intended to carry on the Wilsonian ideals of the League of Nations while adding structures such as the Security Council to aid enforcement. Despite these efforts, antagonism between the U.S. and the Soviet Union grew as Soviet-dominated governments were established in Eastern Europe. President Truman was unwilling to concede Soviet supremacy beyond the borders of the USSR, and remembering Munich with Hitler, he rejected any tendency toward appeasement. Truman was also concerned about American access to raw materials and markets, as well as about the millions of American voters of Eastern European ancestry. Prompted by an influential secret telegraph from Moscow by George F. Kennan, the United States adopted a policy of containment of communism as friction between the two powers intensified. Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech was followed by Soviet refusal to withdraw from Iran, the movement of the American Sixth Fleet to the Black Sea, and a failure to agree on control of atomic weaponry, the secrets of which were now also held by the USSR thanks to a successful Soviet spying effort. In 1947, the British informed the United States that they could no longer assist Greece and Turkey against communist-supplied insurgency. The president announced his Truman Doctrine and asked Congress for military assistance for these two countries. Legislatively, this doctrine entailed the passing of the National Security Act of 1947, which, unifying the armed forces under a single Department of Defense, created the National Security Council to advise the executive on foreign policy matters, and established the CIA, or Central Intelligence Agency, to fill the whole of the Wartime Office of Strategic Services, marking the long-term nature of the coming conflict. In the same year, the United States embarked on the Marshall Plan to help the hungry and homeless of Europe. Rejected by Russians, the plan not only gave aid to Western Europe, but helped stimulate a market for American goods as well. In 1948, the USSR established control in Czechoslovakia and blocked access from Western Germany into West Berlin. The response from the United States was the Berlin Airlift, bringing supplies to over 2 million German citizens. Truman's threats to use atomic force if necessary helped protect the airlift mission, but brought the United States and the Soviet Union remarkably close to war. In light of this tension, the United States founded its first peacetime military alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in 1949. Hostility between Moscow and Washington led also to the division of Asia into contending camps. The United States controlled the former Japanese Empire. General Douglas MacArthur, who had overseen the unconditional surrender of Japanese forces, now oversaw the rebuilding of Japan. In what was perhaps the most successful peace treaty of the 20th century, and gathering significant lessons from the failed Treaty of Versailles after World War I, MacArthur helped the Japanese maintain their dignity even in defeat, preserve their unbroken line of monarchy, and build a powerful and peaceful democratic state. Communism was successful, however, in China when in 1949, despite massive U.S. aid, nationalist forces led by Chiang Kai-shek were driven to the island of Taiwan by the Communist Red Army under Mao Zedong. In 1950, the Truman administration, acting under advisement of the National Security Council's memo NSC 68, had determined that the Soviet challenge required a massive U.S. military buildup. After World War II, Korea was divided at the 38th parallel, with the North within the Soviet sphere. When in 1950 North Korea invaded South Korea, Truman responded immediately. With the USSR absent from the UN Security Council, he obtained UN backing to repel the North Korean attack. Although nearly half the UN troops came from the United States, Congress was never asked for a declaration of war. The UN troops pushed back the invaders, but did not stop at the 38th parallel, and as they moved further north, Chinese military units entered the war. President Truman intended to continue with a policy of limited war, but General Douglas MacArthur wanted to carry the war to China. Fearing that such aggression would draw the Soviet Union into the war, as the previous breach of UN strictures had brought in China, Truman balked. As he said, "We are trying to prevent a world war, not start one." The president relieved the general of his command in 1951, despite intense public disapproval of the action. In Korea, an armistice was finally achieved in 1953 after the death of Joseph Stalin and Eisenhower's veiled threat to use nuclear weapons to break the truce talk deadlock. This map highlights the decolonization in Africa and Asia from 1947 to 1999. Following the Second World War, decolonization movements swept Africa and Asia, liberating many peoples from their colonial rulers. Achieving independence in the post-war international system dominated by the Cold War, most newly independent states became targets of both the United States and the Soviet Union as each sought to advance its interests in these regions, usually by intervention, intrigue, or economic influence. The Cold War became a global phenomenon. This is an image of Ho Chi Minh in 1950. Following the Second World War, the communist organizer and revolutionary Ho Chi Minh led an almost decade-long nationalist struggle to end French colonialism in Indochina. In this image, you see American food being handed out to hungry people in Europe. Grateful English mothers line up for orange juice sent by the United States to assist Europeans devastated by the Second World War. This is an image of the Berlin Airlift, 1948. German children are watching an American plane in Operation Vittles bring food and supplies to their beleaguered city. The airlift kept a city of 2 million people alive for nearly a year and made West Berlin a symbol of the West's resolve to contain the spread of the Soviet Union. The wartime dispute between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies over Poland's future hardened after World War II into a Cold War that split Europe into competing American and Russian spheres of influence. Across an Iron Curtain, NATO countries faced the Warsaw Pact nations, which is the name for the organization created by the Soviet Union to counter NATO's efforts. At the height of the Korean War, President Truman created the Federal Civil Defense Administration, which sought to tell Americans how best to survive a nuclear attack. Much of their effort went into teaching students to duck and shield their eyes from an atomic blast. The Eisenhower administration later changed the emphasis of civil defense to the mass evacuation of populated areas. The policy, said one wag, had switched from duck and cover to, quote, run like hell. The experience of fighting an undeclared war for the limited objective of containing communism confused the generation of Americans who had just fought an all-out war for the total defeat of the Axis. General MacArthur spoke for the many who were frustrated by the Korean conflict's mounting costs in blood and dollars. "There is no substitute for victory," he stated. The Korean War was also the first war in U.S. history in which most soldiers fought in racially integrated units. President Truman ordered the integration of the armed forces in 1948. Despite the opposition of many military officers, and the successful performance of African Americans in Korea accelerated acceptance of military integration. At home, despite pockets of poverty, especially among racial minorities, there was widespread post-war affluence. Americans flocked to suburbia, had many babies, and purchased record amounts of consumer goods. Growing anti-communism helped to ensure that the spirit of the times was conservative, not reformist. The 79th Congress passed the Employment Act of 1946, which established that one of the government's goals would be to ensure economic growth and the maintenance of acceptable employment levels, but then backed away from full implementation of those objectives. The 80th Congress, elected in 1946, opposed Truman's liberal reform efforts and modified the pro-union Wagner Act of 1935 with the more restrictive Taft-Hartley Act. Truman sought to build strength among farmers, ethnic groups, and African Americans. In response to continuing racial violence, he established a Committee on Civil Rights to investigate race relations and safeguard the rights of minorities. The committee report called for anti-lynching laws and anti-poll tax legislation. Southern politicians were outraged. At the Democratic Convention in 1948, Southern segregationists withdrew to form the States' Rights Democratic Party, also known as the Dixiecrats. Truman astonished the nation by winning re-election, which he interpreted as a mandate for his fair deal. He asked Congress to enlarge New Deal programs in economic security, conservation, and housing, and he sought new initiatives on civil rights, national health insurance, federal aid to education, and agricultural subsidies. These new initiatives failed in the face of a Republican and conservative Democratic coalition and Truman's own preoccupation with foreign policy. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, also known as the GI Bill, included among its various programs financial assistance for every veteran of the Second World War who sought further education. Some 8 million veterans would eventually study at technical institutes, trade schools, and universities. Following World War II, the United States achieved the highest living standard in world history. Between 1950 and 1970, the real gross national product, which factors out inflation and reveals the actual amount of goods and services produced, steadily increased. This is an electoral map of Truman's victory. It was a very close election. There was the sense that Truman, with the southern split of Democrats, the Dixiecrats, would not be able to overcome this split within the party. Dewey, who was assured he was going to win, didn't do as much campaigning as he should have. Truman went around the country and with the slogan, "Give 'em hell, Harry," convinced people to vote for him once again. As the Cold War evolved, an increasing number of Americans came to believe that America's foreign difficulties were rooted in disloyalty at home. A second Red Scare shook the nation. In 1947, Truman sought to root out subversives in government service. In Congress, the House Un-American Activities Committee spread fear of communism in the entertainment industry and caused the creation of an unofficial political blacklist. Leaders of the American Communist Party were convicted of conspiring to advocate the overthrow of the government. Fears of the Red Menace were intensified by revelations regarding Alger Hiss and the conviction and execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. On this fertile ground appeared Senator Joseph R. McCarthy of Wisconsin, who beginning in 1950 gained great power merely by accusing others of subversion. While his claims were largely unsubstantiated, that mattered little to McCarthy's many staunch supporters. Frustrated by a perceived lack of American progress in the face of expanding Soviet achievements, McCarthy's demagoguery offered simple answers to the problems facing the nation. Public condemnation of suspected communists became one road to social acceptance. With public apprehension at a high point and the war in Korea at a stalemate, the Republicans took the presidency in 1952. The public servant, popular war hero, and political moderate Dwight D Eisenhower convinced the nation that it's time for a change, while his Vice President Richard Nixon continued to bait the beleaguered Democrats and maintain anti-communist fervor. Although Hollywood generally avoided overtly political films, it released a few dozen explicitly anti-communist films in the post-war era, depicting American communists as vicious hypocrites, if not hardened criminals. Hollywood's Cold War movies, like its blacklist, were an effort to protect its imperiled public image after HUAC's widely publicized investigation of the movie industry. Arrested in 1950 and charged with being members of a Soviet atomic spy ring during World War II, American communists Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were found guilty of conspiring to commit espionage and were executed in 1953. Although they and their defenders protested their innocence, Soviet documents made public in the 1990s identified Julius Rosenberg as a secret communist agent. With the war going badly in Korea in 1950 and communist advances in Eastern Europe and in China, the American public was genuinely frightened about the possibilities of internal subversion. Joseph McCarthy, as chairman of the Government Committee on Operations of the Senate, was in an ideal position to exploit this situation, and he did. His charges of treason in high places made him an instant celebrity, and the anti-communist witch hunt that followed became known as McCarthyism. The darling of his many moderate Republican supporters, Dwight D Eisenhower had a natural talent for taking his case to the American people. At a typical campaign stop, he would speak in simple, reassuring terms, introduce his wife Mamie, promise to clean up the mess in Washington, and wave goodbye as the train pulled away to chants of "I like Ike." Dwight D. Eisenhower easily won the presidency in 1952. While tilting to the right and favoring private corporations, the Eisenhower administration did leave some New Deal reforms in place, expanding social welfare benefits and proposed construction of a vast interstate highway system. Despite the hardline rhetoric of John Foster Dulles, Eisenhower followed a moderate, non-confrontational policy in dealing with the Soviet Union. Eisenhower brought a stability and peace that weary Americans desired. In general, he was pragmatic rather than ideological, wishing to reduce taxes and at the same time expand various social welfare programs. The largest public works program in American history, the Interstate Highway Act, was a major accomplishment of his administration. He was re-elected in 1956 in a landslide. Meanwhile, in foreign policy, Eisenhower continued the containment policy even as he strove to reduce Cold War tensions, despite more extreme tendencies by his party's right wing. Eisenhower's policies were cautious and moderate, even when presented with opportunities in Europe to push communist power out of Eastern Europe. He advocated an Atoms for Peace program and met with Soviet leaders over arms control issues. Meanwhile, the CIA began to uncover operations against governments that tended to be friendly toward communism. In Southeast Asia, Eisenhower took modest steps to maintain the independence of South Vietnam, and in the Middle East, he confronted a major crisis over control of the Suez Canal. This was known as the Eisenhower Doctrine in 1957. On his departure from office, at the end of his term, he warned the nation about the problematic influence of the military-industrial complex, which seemed to connect American economic health to military expenditures, and military contracts had become the staff of life for research scholars, politicians, and America's largest corporations. Overall, Ike had given the majority of Americans what they most wanted: prosperity, reassurance, and a breathing spell in which to relish the comforts of life.